I'm I'm loving this novel. It's just my second read of it, and I'm really happy to give you some of my impressions and thoughts about chapters 15 to 28. Um, in our discussion of Can You Forgive Her, at least one participant commented that it was primarily about the Vavasor family. Alice and George, of course, but also Alice's father, Father John, her grandfather, her cousin Kate, and her aunt, the inimitable Mrs. Greenow, formerly Arabella Vavasor. Although the old squire is ostensibly the head of the family, I think a case could be made that Aunt Greenow, who does end up in the manor house, is the practical head of the family. She steps in and manages things in times of need and crises. In He Knew He Was Right, the Stanbury family is similarly taking center stage, headed somewhat reluctantly and crankily by Aunt Jemima Stanbury. I am thoroughly enjoying the reveal of Aunt Jemima's contradictory character. We are not told why she estranged herself from her brother's family, leaving them to live in poverty so severe that they have relied on the generosity of Mrs. Crockett from the Stag and Antlers for food donations, all the while paying for nephew Hugh's education, and, when he disappoints, taking in her young niece Dorothy as a paid, albeit poorly paid, companion. Quote, her aunt, indeed, was imperious, but did not seem to require humility in her companion. All the good things that were eaten and drunk were divided between them with the strictest impartiality. Her aunt never gave her any orders before company, and always spoke of her before the servants as one whom they were to obey and respect. End of quote. The narrator is very fond of the Stanbury family. They are all, quote, filled with the same eager readiness to believe themselves to be right, and to own themselves to others to be wrong when they have been constrained to make such confession to themselves. In all was to be found the same belief in self, which amounted almost to conceit, the same warmth of affection, and the same love of justice, unquote. Although a confirmed spinster herself, Miss Jemima Stanbury has strong views about the behaviors of married women. Of course, she has strong views about everything. She likes her own way. She says, quote, but now, what with divorce bills and women's rights and penny papers and false hair and married women being just like giggling girls, and giggling girls knowing just as much as married women, when a woman has been married a year or two, she begins to think whether mayn't she have more fun for her money by living apart from her husband, unquote. Her other niece, Priscilla, is also determinedly single. She has strong views on the behaviors. She also has strong views on the behaviors of married women. Quote, I am not fit to marry. I am often cross, and I like my own way, and I have a distaste for men. I never in my life saw a man whom I wished even to make my intimate friend. But I think that when a woman is married, there is nothing to which she should not submit on behalf of her husband, unquote. Aunt and niece really are very much alike. Both disapprove of Emily and regret the situation that Hugh has put them in. Hugh is doing his best to help his friend Trevelyan, but he does have an ulterior motive. He is keen to have the very pretty and amiable Nora Rowley living with his mother and sister, where, quote, the house in which he would see her in some sort was his own. He would be sleeping under the same roof with her and would have all the advantages which such a position would give him. End of quote. The Clock House, a 3-story red brick house with a clock tower but no clock, and a garden surrounded by high walls, is in Nuncombe Putney, a parish 20 miles west of Exeter. Quote, about 9 miles from Nuncomputney is the prison establishment, at which are kept convicts undergoing penal servitude. End of quote. Dartmoor. The narrator enthuses about the landscape, and although there is the constant excitement created by the possibility of an escaped prisoner, Priscilla, Nora, and Emily choose this 18-mile excursion because of the charm of the wild and beautiful scenery. Well, possibly. But the women living in the clockhouse are in a very real sense incarcerated. Even though the clockhouse is vine-covered and comfortable, they are not free to come and go or receive visitors. Their exercise is strolling in the walled garden, completely hidden from the outside world. Their wanderings on the moorland are very much like those of a prisoner escaping from Dartmoor. For a few hours, quote, the cloud was lifted off Emily's mind, and the load of her sorrow made light to her by the special vigor of the air of the moor. End of quote. Later, after Emily receives the letter from Colonel Osborne asking to call, she argues, quote, if Mrs. Stanbury thinks that I am going to be treated as a prisoner, or that I will not judge myself as to whom I may see or whom I may not see, she is very much mistaken. End of quote. Poor Mrs. Stanbury, a most reluctant and ineffectual jailer. But visitors do search out and visit the young women banished into the wilds of Dartmoor. When they return from their brief escape, they find that Mr. Glascock has been waiting patiently to speak to Nora. Emily makes it clear that Nora's position as the wife of the future Lord Peterborough would quite possibly be the means of Emily's escape from the prison of her own marriage. Attempting to convince her reflection in the mirror of her duty to her family, Nora decides that when Mr. Glascock asks her to marry him, she will say yes. But all is lost when, instead, he asked, Nora, do you think that you can love me? To say yes to this would be a lie. She answers, I do not love you. I love someone else. He leaves. Nora says to Emily, I am willing enough, I believe, to sell myself to the devil, but I don't know how to do it. Aunt Stanbury, hearing of this visit, assumes it has been the wicked Colonel Osborne visiting Emily and fires off a letter to her sister-in-law, harshly criticizing her for allowing this. Priscilla writes the angry reply, quote, Dear Aunt Stanbury, you have found a mare's nest. The gentleman you speak of has never been here at all, and the people who bring you news have probably hoaxed you. End of quote. Aunt Stanbury admits that she has been wrong. But the tables turn again when the infamous colonel manufactures a visit to the neighborhood, ostensibly to call on his old friend, another old friend, the vicar of Cockchafington, especially to see the porch of the church at Cockchafington. Priscilla says, a church fiddlestick. When Emily receives the colonel's letter, she feels excitement. I wonder if Ellen Moody is right. Emily persists in seeing the colonel because it is sexually exciting. Emily thinks, quote, he cared for her. He was gracious to her. He appreciated her talents, her beauty, and her conduct. He knew that she deserved a treatment very different from that accorded to her by her husband, unquote. She asserts that she is not a prisoner and replies, quote, There are reasons which would seem to make it expedient that you should stay away, even though circumstances are bringing you into the immediate neighborhood. But of these reasons, I leave you to be the judge. Personally, I shall be glad to see you as I have always been. Oh, Emily. Apollyon, aka that devil of a colonel, is admitted to the dovecot by the terrified servant girl. Although he stays for almost an hour with Emily and Nora, they speak only of the Rowley family matters. The colonel cannot make love to Emily with Nora by her side. Quote, and yet, though not a word was spoken to which Mr. Trevelyan himself could have taken the slightest exception, the visit, futile as it was, could not but do an enormous deal of harm. Priscilla again says it like it is. It was a dastardly and most ungentlemanlike thing to do. Unquote. And now Priscilla must apologize to Anne Stanbury. How great, how terrible, how crushing would be Aunt Stanbury's triumph. If you want privacy and confidentiality in your affairs, don't live in a small town, I can tell you. Trevelyan had no need to hire Basil to find out if the hawk had been at the dovecot. By the time Osborne heads back to London, everybody knows everything. All Trevelyan had to do was drop by the Stag and Antlers and have a chat with Mrs. Crockett, or better still, with the wooden-legged postman, in order to learn more than Basil could ever tell him. But hire Basil he did, and Basil is not in this business for the good of anyone but himself. Quote, he had a scale of pilfering of his own, to which he had easily reconciled his conscience, and beyond that he prided himself on the honesty of his accounts. Unquote. He is unhappy that Trevelyan has also asked Hugh to spy on Emily. Hugh might discover some of Basil's pilfering ways. When Hugh visits Trevelyan in the Lincoln Inn rooms where he is now living, Basil, even though Trevelyan has paid and dismissed him, intrudes on their conversation, claiming that Emily has written another letter to Osborne just that morning, a lie which nets Basil continuing work and pushes Trevelyan over the edge of reason. I do wonder what is the story behind the fact that Basil is an ex-policeman. On the platform at Exeter, Hugh's journey towards Nuneham Putney intersects with Osborne's trip back to London, and the result is a most unpleasant encounter. The colonel admits to visiting Emily, but maintains his innocence, saying, I presume the lady is not a prisoner in your mother's house. Hugh points out that Osborne knew exactly the mischief his visit would cause. The narrator tells us, sarcastically I think, quote, Colonel Osborne did not know that he was lying. He really thought when he spoke that he had gone down to Loughborough to see the remarkable piece of antiquity. Unquote. I think the colonel himself is quite a remarkable piece of antiquity. Musing on his fond feelings for Nora, Hugh finds that the price of transportation from the train station at Loughborough to Nuneham Putney has increased by 1/3, from 9 pence to 1 shilling. Quote, the truth was that gigs to Nuneham Putney had gone up, since a lady, separated from her husband with a colonel running after her, had been taken in at the Clock House. Unquote. The locals are quite happy for the scandal to continue. Although Hugh's unexpected arrival makes Emily feel defensive and spied upon, as she is, his visit is very welcome to his mother, sister, and especially Nora, who thinks, quote, how sweet, Sweetest of all things in heaven or earth might be an August evening with him among the lanes. After an early Sunday dinner, the four young people ramble 3 miles to Nidden Park, a beautiful wild slope of ground full of ancient, blighted, blasted, but still half-living oaks, overlooking a bend of the River Tean. But Nora is disappointed. Hugh keeps his distance and accuses her of being dainty. She is very angry and hurt and cries herself to sleep. Quote, while she was sobbing in bed, he was sitting with a short black pipe stuck into his mouth on the corner of the churchyard wall opposite. End of quote. He regrets throwing away a perfect opportunity to tell Nora of his feelings. He tries to untangle the pros and cons of sexual love, and the result is a most moving soliloquy. Hugh Stanbury Smokes His Pipe, chapter 25, is my favorite part so far in this novel. And then, quote, and then he began to speculate on love, that love of which the poets wrote, and of which he found that some sparkle was necessary to give light to his life. Then, through the cloud of smoke, there came upon him some dim idea of self-abnegation. The mysterious valley among the mountains, the far-off prospect of which was so charming to him, which made the poetry of his life, was in fact the capacity of caring for other human beings, more for other human beings than for himself. The beauty of it all was not so much in the thing loved as in the loving. End of quote. Not something Louis Trevelyan could understand. In the last 2 chapters of this section, 27 and 28, his rage escalates to the point where he cannot imagine ever living with Emily again. Even so, he is determined to keep her a prisoner, separated from the world in general and Colonel Osborne in particular. Trevelyan pats himself on the back for continuing to provide her with her basic needs. She, who, quote, had come to him without a shilling, and yet, bad as her treatment of him had been, he was willing to give not only support to her, but her sister also, with every comfort, severe. No, not he. But how can he enforce his demands? Quote, as wives are managed nowadays, he could not forbid her the use of the post office, could not hinder her from seeing this hypocritical scoundrel. End of quote. He thinks he wants to dispose of her, to crush her, and he has the ideal weapon to accomplish this, their child. He writes, quote, if you correspond with him or see him, I will at once take our boy away from you, unquote. From the first moment of the quarrel, Emily has been afraid of this weapon, but refused to believe that Louis would use it. His friend Lady Milborough tells him that letter will drive her to despair. He spends the day indulging in his misery, rereading the letter, quote, every harsh word that it contained was in some sort pleasant to his ear. She had hit him hard, and should he not hit her again? Unquote. He posts the letter. The last chapter in this group is overwhelmingly a great tribulation. Tribulation is defined as distress or suffering resulting from oppression or persecution. Emily is indeed driven to despair. She wants to run away, but she has nowhere to run. Quote, if I were to go to an inn at once, people would speak evil of me, and I have no money. Unquote. Priscilla wants out of this situation almost as urgently. They can't go back to the cottage. They are pulling down the cottage, Priscilla, says her mother. Nora is furious at Hugh, blaming him for their expulsion from the clockhouse. Quote, for this man she had sent away that other lover, and had even confessed that it was so. They all felt the intolerable injustice, as it appeared to them, of their subjection to the caprice of an unreasonable and ill-conditioned man. But to all of them it seemed plain that in this matter the husband must exercise his own will. End of quote. They are oppressed and persecuted by a madman, and the law is all on his side. They have no choice but to stay cloistered in the clockhouse and unhappily await Trevelyan's next move. I've mentioned before that I am a fan of illustrations, and the ones by Marcus Stone that were in the first editions can be viewed on Gutenberg.org. I highly recommend checking them out, particularly the wooden-legged postman, and I think Dominique will tell us something more about that in a minute. I also recommend the star-studded BBC 2004 miniseries. At this point in our reading, you could watch episode 1 with no spoilers. Anna Massey is superb as Anne Stanbury. David Tennant is brilliant as usual in the role of Mr. Gibson. But Bill Nighy's Colonel Osborne steals every scene he appears in. And almost 20 years later, it is rumored he will get an Oscar nomination for his role in Living, the remake of Kurosawa's 1952 classic, transferred to 50s London by writer Kazuo Ishiguro. I think the nominations are announced tomorrow. Some questions to ponder. Are the adventures of the Stanbury family central or peripheral? Are they really a subplot? What's love got to do with it? Compare Hugh's thoughts on love to Trevelyan's. Are Emily and Nora prisoners? What makes them prisoners? How might they escape? Thank you.